Benjamin Siegel here. Welcome back to this introduction to India and South Asia, to the Great Depression, to the Second World War, and we move to the cusp of independence and the release of the Congress leadership from jail. It shouldn't be any surprise what's going to happen next. India is on the verge of becoming independent, but it's also going to be cleaved into the Republic of India and the new nation of Pakistan, which is nominally going to be a homeland for Indian Muslims. What happens in 1947, partition, is gigantic. In many ways, I think it was avoidable, and it only became inevitable in the very last days of British rule. It owes a lot to the particulars of the personalities and the politics that were at work in the negotiations over independence and which came to the fore in the very end. But at the same time, partition drew upon ideas that were much older. Notions about what it means to be a Muslim and what it means to be Indian. And the idea and the debate over whether the Indian Muslim was a religious category, a political category, a little bit of both, or maybe neither. This is such a complicated thought that we're going to stretch it out a little bit. Today, I'm going to talk about the long history of the Indian Muslim as a political theory, and then the 1940s politics in India that led up to partition. Then, next time, we're going to pick up with a discussion of how partition actually happened, and how two nations were created out of one at that moment of independence, with a tremendous and tragic amount of death and bloodshed. Let me start out with the first stanza of a poem written by an important Muslim poet at the turn of the 20th century, named Altaf Hussain Ali. You're not going to need to know who he is, but you might want to take note of the fact that he was the protege and star student of Syed Ahmed Khan, who we've talked a little bit about before. His poem starts out like this: "Farewell, Hindustan, autumnless garden. We, your homeless guests, have stayed too long. Laden though we are today with complaints, the marks of your past favors are still upon us. You treated strangers like relations. We were guests, but you made us hosts. You gave us wealth, government, and dominion, for which your many kindnesses should we express gratitude. But this hospitality is ultimately unsustainable. All that you gave us in the end, all that you gave, you kept in the end. You have the right to your property. Take it from whoever you want, give it to whoever you will, pull out our tongues this very instant that they forcefully utter a word of complaint about this. But the complaint is that what we brought with us, that too you took away, and turned us into beggars." So long as Hindustan we were not called Hindi, we had some graces which were not found in others. They've made our condition frightening. We were fire, Hindustan, you've turned us into ash. This is a complicated poem, and there's a lot in it. There's the idea that India was at some point a wonderful host to Muslims. There's also the idea that Islam, or the Indian Muslim himself, has been changed by the encounter with India. But there's also the idea that the Muslim stay in India has done damage to the Muslim soul or psyche. The idea we were fire and you've turned us into ash. This, in some ways, captures a big idea in South Asian political consciousness that was percolating in the last decades of the 19th century and well into the 20th. The remembrance of the rise of Muslim power throughout the 17th century and then its decline until what then was the present day. The closer and closer that Indian independence seemed, the bigger Muslim anxiety grew over what role Muslims would have in a future Indian state. There were fears that Indian Muslims would be deeply subservient, second-class citizens in the independent India that was about to come into being. So let's try to understand this fear. And we'll start where we often start when we talk about modern Islam in South Asia, with Syed Ahmed Khan. Syed Ahmed Khan is often credited with being the founder or the progenitor of the two-nation theory, the idea that Hindus and Muslims in India comprise two distinct nations that were simply living in the same place. This idea of two nations wasn't something that Syed Ahmed Khan said himself, but we can see Syed Ahmed Khan as being deeply important in helping the British and maybe others recognize Indian Muslims as a distinct political category. Syed Ahmed Khan, again the founder of that modern Muslim school in Aligarh, lobbied for Muslim inclusion in electorates, and he helped eventually to found the Muslim League, one of the first political parties to think of Indian Muslims in that specific term. But it wasn't Syed Ahmed Khan who really gave us this two-nation idea. It was instead Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal was a philosopher, poet, and politician, and in 1930 he was the president of the Muslim League. When he gave his presidential address at the end of the year, Iqbal offered for the first time his vision for an independent state for Muslim-majority provinces, specifically in the northwest of India. He said, "I would like to see the Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh, and Baluchistan amalgamated into a single state. Self-governance within the British Empire, or without the British Empire, the formation of a consolidated Northwest Indian Muslim state, appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims, at least of Northwest India." It's not fully clear by what... When Iqbal said an Indian Muslim state, it's not fully clear what he meant. He probably didn't mean it was going to be a theocracy. He did argue that Islam came with specific legal concepts and that religious ideals were inseparable from culture and social order. But that idea was about to grow a little more specific. In 1933, overseas in Cambridge, a group of students got together and they came up with the name Pakistan. That name did two things. First, it was an acronym. It stood for the names of the provinces that it was supposed to include: Pakistan, Afghan, Sindh, and Baluchistan. And secondly, the word Pakistan meant land of the pure. The student who came up with this text was named Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. He was a Muslim nationalist studying at Cambridge, and in 1933 he published a text that he called "Now or Never, Are We to Live or Perish Forever?", which is also known as the Pakistan Declaration. It begins like this: "At this solemn hour in the history of India, when British and Indian statesmen are laying the foundations of a federal constitutions for that land, we address this appeal to you in the name of our common heritage, on behalf of our 30 million Muslim brethren who live in Pakistan, by which we mean the 5 northern units of India: Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan." This was a student's document. It was sort of fantastical. It wasn't something from the world of practical politics. It didn't really seem in 1933 as fully aligned with the political situation of the day. Muslim interests in India were fairly well protected by regional parties in Muslim-majority areas in the northwest and the east that would eventually become Pakistan, while minority Muslims in other regions wouldn't gain anything from a new state that didn't include them. But things were changing, and the key figure in this story was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah, like Nehru and Gandhi, was a lawyer. He had studied in London, where he had been influenced by Indian nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, and in 1910 he was elected to the Legislative Council in India. He began his career, as most nationalists did, in the Congress, but after the First World War he quit to join the Muslim League. In the teens, Jinnah had been deeply involved in the debates over the Lucknow Pact, which, if you remember, demanded elected majorities in all councils and separate electorates for Muslims. Jinnah hadn't done very well for the Muslim League in the 1937 elections. Under his leadership, that party received just 5% of the total Muslim vote, and it emerged as a predominant party in none of the Muslim-majority provinces. The Muslim League in 1937 looked like it was finished. The Congress had gained a lot of popularity, and it was continuing to do so, and other smaller regional parties were representing Muslims in Muslim-majority provinces. The Muslim League needed to do something if it was going to shore up its popularity and survive as independence approached. So in 1940, the League proclaimed that in any future constitutional plan, the areas in which Muslims are numerically a majority should be grouped to constitute independent states in which the constituent units should be autonomous and sovereign. In many ways, this sounded like a call for independence. It was later known as the Lahore Declaration, after the city in which it was made. And Jinnah explained this demand by appealing to the notion of two nations. Muslims, he wrote, are not a minority as is commonly known and understood. Muslims are a nation, according to any definition of nation, and they must have their homelands, their territory, and their state. We wish to live in peace and harmony with our neighbors as a free and independent people. We wish our people to develop to the fullest our spiritual, cultural, economic, social, and political life in a way we think best in consonance with our own ideals and according to the genius of our people. On some level, it sounds here like Indian Muslims were moving towards the idea of two states, but nothing at this point was fixed or inevitable. We shouldn't read back what happened in 1947 into the Declaration of 1940. The course of what happened to Muslim politics between those years is the source of a lot of debate among historians. But I think it's important to remember that until at least 1946, no one, not Jinnah, the provincial Muslim leadership, and certainly not the British, envisioned or desired the partition that took place. Most Muslims opposed any sort of partition whatsoever. In provinces where there were Muslim majorities like Punjab, there were already Muslim parties in power, so there was no benefit to a separate state. Other Muslims, including many of the ulema, or the religious, educated class, allied with the Congress. They were a lot more focused on promoting individual morality among Muslims and cooperation between religious communities in an independent India than a separate state, which wasn't on any of their minds. When people talked about Pakistan, they did use that word in those days. They didn't really have any ideas of what borders it might have, or whether it would be one state, or two states, or a federation of many different states. It was an unclear term. The most convincing interpretations that historians have suggested is that Jinnah saw the idea of Pakistan not as a separate state, but as a useful bargaining card or a chip to be played in a post-war settlement. What happened in 1940 when Jinnah started to talk about a separate state really feels like a continuation of a longer strategy where Muslims were going to seek a better position for themselves by electoral representation, the reservation of seats, or the idea of Muslim majority provinces. We talked last time about the incredible impact that the Second World War had on India, from the emergence of the Indian National Army under Subhash Chandra Bose to the devastation of the Bengal famine. So we'll fast forward a little bit to the end of the war, when the British began to reopen negotiations on India's future after the failure of the Cripps mission before. In June 1945, the Viceroy brought together Gandhi, Jinnah, and essentially the entire Congress and Muslim League leadership together in the hill station of Shimla, the British summer capital. It was only a few weeks earlier that the Congress leadership had been released from jail, so this was an incredible sight. The leader of the Congress at this point was Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru was the son of Motilal Nehru, who had been a prominent lawyer and nationalist statesman. Jawaharlal had grown up in the city of Allahabad with exceptional wealth. His father had been one of the first Indians to buy and import an automobile. And Nehru had been sent to Harrow and Cambridge in the United Kingdom to train, again, as a lawyer. When Nehru returned to India, he enrolled in the Allahabad High Court, but he found that he wasn't very interested in the law. It was really nationalist politics calling to him. He became a rising star in Indian politics during the 19-teens, and he became the prominent leader of the left wing of the Congress in the 1920s. Not quite as left as Subhash Chandra Bose, but certainly leaning towards a socialist bent. By the end of the 1920s, Nehru had emerged as the undisputed leader of the Congress, with the support and approval of his mentor, Mohandas Gandhi. You might remember that in 1929, Nehru for the Congress had called for Purna Swaraj, or complete independence. Let's talk a little bit about what he meant. In the 1930s, Nehru was putting forth the vision of a secular, modernizing nation-state. Nehru was inspired by the example of Soviet Russia, and he saw the future of India as one that would be characterized by industrialization, a soft kind of socialism, and a progressive vision for the future. In 1936, he said, "I see no way of ending the poverty, the vast unemployment, the degradation, and the subjugation of the Indian people except through socialism. That involves vast and revolutionary changes in our political and social structure, the ending of private property except in a restricted sense, and the replacement of the present profit system by a higher ideal of cooperative service. If the future is full of hope, it is largely because of Soviet Russia and what it has done." This was very different than the view that Gandhi had for the future of India. When Gandhi looked to independence, he saw India as a village republic with a very loose state, where local industries would be linked together in a rough village republic. Nehru instead saw a powerful state, one that was industrializing, that had a lot of strength at the center, and that would propel India forward out of the past to be a pioneer to the world. Nehru had a harder time communicating this vision to the Indian masses. Sometimes Nehru was halting when he spoke in Hindi, and he didn't really have a populist touch. He was fancy. But Nehru had nationalist zeal, and it did make him popular eventually. He led Congress to a commanding electoral victory in 1937, and like the rest of the Congress leadership, he spent the war years in jail, building a reputation as a soldier for India's future. But now that he had been released, Nehru was meeting with Gandhi, with Lord Wavell, the Viceroy, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah in Shimla to discuss and to negotiate the eventual transition to independence. Wavell was ready to move and to make a deal. He wanted to break the political deadlock, and so he set up an executive council to advise him that, except for himself and his commander-in-chief, was entirely Indian, and it had the goal of forming an Indian interim government to help usher in independence. Muslims had demanded that the council would have an equal number of caste Hindus, not Dalits, and Muslims, and Lord Wavell had agreed to this demand. But these negotiations collapsed when Jinnah insisted that he was the sole spokesman for India's Muslims. He insisted that the Muslim League had the right and the duty to nominate all of the Muslim members of this council, and that Congress didn't have any. Jinnah was deeply stubborn, and he preferred no political progress at all to any acknowledgement that the Congress had a right to represent Muslim opinion as well. And so Jinnah, deliberately or not, wrecked the Shimla Conference. In some ways, this was proof that because the Muslim League had worked hard in its politics and collaborated with the British government during the war, it had a lot more power than when it had lost in the 1937 elections. As all of this was happening, things were beginning to look bad for Britain in a lot of other ways. It was this period when Britain lost the power and the will to control what was happening on the ground in India. In July 1945, Winston Churchill's Conservative government fell, and a new Labour ministry under Clement Attlee replaced it. Labour liked to claim later on that it was always in favour of independence and opposed to the British Empire. That wasn't fully true, but the Labour victory in Britain did give the cause of Indian independence, and the Congress in particular, a sympathetic view. Maybe more important than sympathy was money. Britain had won the war with the rest of the Allies, but it had spent a lot of resources in the process. It didn't have the manpower or the money needed to coerce India into remaining in the empire any longer. The British public was living through post-war austerity. They wanted jobs and housing, and the socialist government in Britain was ready to try to give it to them. And this goal was going to have to take precedence over a costly effort to regain and reconsolidate empire. In 1946, there was also a major naval mutiny in Bombay. This underscored to India's rulers that India's military couldn't be counted on anymore. By 1945, half the Indian civil service was Indian. These were men who were still loyal to the British Crown, but also were looking forward to service under a national Indian government. So by 1946, all that Britain could hope to do was to arrange for a peaceful transfer of power. And the Viceroy insisted that that transfer would be to leaders whom the Indian people have chosen for themselves. But Jinnah's stubbornness reminded them that even this wasn't going to be an easy task. Things were shifting and coming to an endgame in the winter of 1945 and 1946. There were elections this winter, and many of the smaller provincial parties which had done all right in 1937 were removed from power. There were really only two Indian parties left, the Congress and the Muslim League, and now these two parties were positioned against one another. Congress was fairly certain that what was going to happen in 1945 and 46 was going to look just like 1937. They'd enjoy a resounding victory, and the party would have its reputation enhanced by their role in the Quit India movement and all that time that its leaders had spent in jail. They were more or less right. The Congress won around 90% of the votes cast for the central legislature in open or non-Muslim constituencies, and they formed governments in 8 provinces. But the Muslim League also did well for itself. It won 30 reserved seats in the central legislature and 442 of the 500 Muslim seats in the provincial assemblies. In 1937, the Muslim League was spent. It looked like it had failed completely. But over 8 years, the party had transformed itself. And it underscored what Jinnah had said, that the League and the League alone represented the political will of India's Muslims. What that actually meant was fairly uncertain. To understand this a bit more, we've got to understand Jinnah himself. Jinnah was cold, he was aloof. Most people who met him thought he was fairly arrogant. He was very tall and lanky, and he wore Western suits. No one thought of him as a charismatic leader. He also wasn't very religious. Many scholars think that he was an atheist, and he didn't really live a devout Muslim life. He was a big whiskey drinker, for example. But he had a powerful personality, and most people who met Jinnah went away convinced by what he said. Jinnah had his greatest success making pitches to educated Muslims, people who'd graduated from universities like Aligarh, where ideas of modern Muslim nationalism had been born. It was a bit harder for Jinnah and the Muslim League to reach the rural population, especially in Muslim-majority provinces where other parties were more successful. While some of India's elite Muslims worried about what place they would have in an India run by the Congress, Muslims in Punjab and Bengal were more or less protected by numbers. They were majorities in those provinces. But Jinnah knew that he would need to get their support if any kind of Pakistan was going to come into being. And so Jinnah had to set out to win their allegiance to the Muslim League. He sent his deputies to Bengal, where he worked to erode support for the Krishak Praja Party, which was a nominally Muslim party that had been fairly weak. In the wake of the famine, that government had been toppled, and there was a Muslim League government there instead. In Punjab, there was a powerful Muslim party called the Unionist Party. It was bound together by ideas of clan and kin, but Jinnah and his deputies went over the heads of the clan leaders to appeal directly to peasants. He worked to gain the support of Sufi peers or masters in shrines around the countryside, and he rallied rural voters with the cry of Islam in danger. Historically, when politicians appealed to Islam, they weren't making an appeal to religion, but an appeal to the idea of Islam as a political identity or a community. But in 1946, Jinnah worked to drum up religious sentiment as well. One election agent said, "Wherever I went, everyone kept saying, if we don't vote for the League, we'd become infidels." The Muslim League's work in the elections of 1945 and 46 transformed the meaning of Pakistan. It came to mean two different things. On the one hand, Pakistan represented a modern nation-state for India's Muslims, and it was the logical culmination of the long process of colonial Muslim politics. But also, as a symbolic representation of Muslim identity, the word Pakistan seemed to signify something bigger than a state. It evoked an ideal Islamic political order, where an Islamic life could be fused with the ritual authority of the state. It was something transcendent. So in short, the election really brought the Muslim League from being a marginal party into an important and central player in Indian politics. And it transformed the idea of Pakistan from a total abstraction to something with more popular appeal, even if it wasn't fully concrete. The British couldn't get the Muslim League and the Congress to agree. So in March 1946, they authorized a high-level cabinet mission, and they sent it to India to devise a plan of its own. They came up with a very convoluted plan. It called for an independent India with a complex three-tiered federation scheme, and its central feature was the creation of different provincial groupings. Two of these groups would comprise the Muslim provinces of East and West, and a third would comprise the Hindu-majority regions of the center and the south. These groups would be responsible for most of government's functioning, but they'd be subordinate to a central union government that would control things like defense, foreign affairs, and communications. The British hoped that this scheme would preserve the idea of a united India, just like the Congress wanted, but that it would also secure the essence of Jinnah's demand for Pakistan. This was really close to what Jinnah wanted. Not an independent state necessarily, but a large and powerful Pakistan bloc that was made up of different provinces able to secure Muslim interests. He didn't want what he would later describe as a maimed, mutilated, and moth-eaten Pakistan, in which all non-Muslim majority districts would be separated from the new state. Jinnah wanted parity and equality between Pakistan with Hindu India. He probably would have wanted to have two groups instead, a Pakistan on one side and a Hindustan on the other, instead of three, but this was close enough for Jinnah. And so the Muslim League accepted the cabinet mission's proposal. The ball was now in the Congress's court, but they weren't as pleased with this plan. While this scheme preserved a unified India, the Congress leadership, and Nehru in particular, came to the conclusion that this proposed center would be just too weak to achieve the goals of the Congress. Nehru and his socialist wing wanted a central government that could powerfully direct and plan for a free India, work to develop industry, remove its poverty, make India into a world power. And that vision of a powerful center in India was also supported by India's business community and industrialists. So in July 1946, Nehru gave a speech to repudiate the idea of the grouping of provinces. He said that provinces must be free to join any group or none. And so with that move and that speech, Nehru destroyed the cabinet mission scheme, and with it, any hope for a united India. The Congress seemed to make the calculation in this time that it would be better to have a completely independent and separate Pakistan than a state hobbled by provinces that were too strong themselves. Next time, we're going to look at how this all played out on the ground, when we looked at the tragic partition of India into the Republic of India and Pakistan. We'll pick it up then. See you next time.